What if the Book of Enoch turns out to be far more than ancient mythology, something with a much deeper reality behind it? For generations, the Book of Enoch has stood as one of the most debated and enigmatic writings ever uncovered. It brims with unusual visions, heavenly figures, and accounts that never found their way into mainstream religious canon. Now, using the capabilities of Grock AI, researchers are examining its language, recurring patterns, and layered meanings in ways that simply weren't possible before. But rather than bringing clarity, the findings are surfacing connections and interpretations that are pushing people to reconsider what this old text might truly be telling us. If you're just joining us, hit subscribe and come along for the ride. We explore ancient writings, buried history, and the questions most channels tend to avoid asking. What exactly is the Book of Enoch, and why was it kept out of sight? The Book of Enoch, also referred to as First Enoch, is an ancient Jewish religious work credited to Enoch, who was the great-grandfather of Noah. Scholars place its origins somewhere between 300 BCE and 100 BCE, though many believe certain portions are considerably older than that. It follows Enoch's travels through the heavens, his meetings with angels and fallen beings, and vivid prophecies about judgment, the structure of the cosmos, and the final days of the world. For the vast majority of Western Christianity, this text simply does not exist within the official canon. It was left out of the Bible during the early church councils, and for well over 1,000 years, the complete version was essentially unknown to the Western world. The one Christian tradition that preserved it within its official scripture was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which kept it written in the ancient Ge'ez language. That is actually where the first complete version found its way back to Western awareness when Scottish explorer James Bruce returned from Ethiopia in 1773, carrying copies with him. Here is what makes it so significant. The Book of Enoch is directly cited in the biblical Book of Jude, and a great number of scholars believe it had a direct influence on the theological thinking of New Testament writers. Jesus and his followers almost certainly had knowledge of this text. So the question that has always loomed large is this: why was it removed? Was it considered too radical, too specific in its claims, or did it carry ideas that certain powerful figures preferred not to see spreading freely? That mystery is precisely what drove people to feed it into an AI to begin with. They wanted to examine it free from the layers of centuries of religious politics, and Grock offered a way to do just that. So what is Grock AI, and what makes it useful for this kind of analysis? Grock is an artificial intelligence system developed by xAI, the AI company founded by Elon Musk. It launched toward the end of 2023 and has been built around the idea of answering questions with more directness and a greater willingness to venture into unconventional territory compared to some of its rivals. It works from an enormous training data set and is capable of detailed textual analysis, recognizing recurring themes, comparing literary structures, and breaking down complex ideas into understandable terms. Using AI to study ancient religious texts is not entirely without precedent. Computational tools have already been applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, and the New Testament by researchers over the years. But what sets the experience of running something like the Book of Enoch through a conversational AI like Grock apart is how accessible it becomes. Everyday people, not only university academics, can pose layered, thoughtful questions and receive organized, substantive answers. You can ask it to compare specific chapters, trace recurring symbols, or unpack theological implications in everyday language. What those researchers and curious readers discovered when doing this was that Grock didn't simply produce a summary of the Book of Enoch. It identified structural patterns, thematic groupings, and theological tensions buried within the text that had previously only been discussed in academic papers that most people never had a reason to encounter. It also drew meaningful connections between the Book of Enoch and other ancient writings, ranging from Mesopotamian mythology all the way to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that made the whole analysis genuinely worthwhile and illuminating. The important thing to keep in mind is that Grock is not making any supernatural claims. It's doing what large language models are built to do, recognizing patterns in language, drawing connections between ideas, and presenting those connections in a clear way. But when the source material is something as deeply layered and ancient as First Enoch, those patterns turn into something genuinely compelling. The Watchers, the section AI, flagged straight away. Among the first things Grock highlighted while working through the Book of Enoch was the portion known as the Book of the Watchers, spanning chapters 1 through 36. This section introduces a group of celestial beings called the Watchers, angels originally tasked with observing humankind, who made the fateful choice to come down to earth, take human women as wives, and father hybrid offspring known as the Nephilim. This isn't some minor subplot tucked away in the margins. It is the central premise of the book's entire opening section. What Grock identified is that this story directly links to Morn and in many ways expands on a handful of cryptic verses found in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, where sons of God take daughters of men as wives and give rise to giants. The Book of Enoch goes further by naming these watchers individually, identifying their leader as Samjaza, and laying out in considerable detail the forbidden knowledge they passed on to humanity, things like metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery, and the hidden secrets of astrology. Grock also drew attention to something that scholars have debated for a long time. The Watcher's narrative shares strong structural similarities with ancient Mesopotamian texts, especially the stories surrounding the Apkallu, semi-divine figures in Sumerian and Babylonian tradition who were believed to have descended from the heavens and introduced civilization to humankind. The overlap is close enough that certain researchers have concluded both traditions were drawing on an even older body of shared source material. The reason this matters specifically for the AI analysis is that Grock was capable of mapping these connections across several texts at once, something a single human researcher moving through one book at a time simply cannot do with the same efficiency. It laid out those overlaps plainly and without any particular agenda, which made the case for these cultural ties far more accessible to general readers. The Nephilim connection and what AI made of it. The Nephilim, the children born of the Watchers and human women, are portrayed in the Book of Enoch as giants who devoured everything humanity managed to produce, then turned their violence toward people themselves, and eventually toward one another. After their deaths, their spirits were said to linger on the earth as evil spirits, a claim the text presents as the very origin of demonic activity in the world. This is a weighty theological assertion, and Grock analyzed how well it fits, or fails to fit, within mainstream Christian and Jewish theology. What it found is that this narrative fills in an explanatory framework that the canonical Bible leaves noticeably incomplete. Scripture mentions the Nephilim, but offers no account of their ultimate fate or any explanation of where evil spirits originated. The Book of Enoch steps into that silence with a very precise answer. Grock also noted that the Nephilim concept surfaces across other ancient cultures, just under different names. The Greek Titans, the Sumerian demigods, and certain readings of fallen heroic figures in ancient Egyptian texts have all been compared to the Nephilim by scholars over the years. To be clear, AI is not making any claim that these beings actually existed. What it is doing is observing that the narrative archetype of powerful hybrid beings who bring corruption into the world appears in nearly every ancient culture on record, and that is a genuinely remarkable anthropological finding. From the perspective of storytelling and religious studies, Grock's analysis drove home a single clear point. The Book of Enoch was no fringe curiosity. It was a detailed, internally coherent cosmological narrative that tackled questions about the origin of evil, the architecture of the spiritual realm, and the destiny of humanity, all with far greater specificity than anything found in the Bible's canonical books. The fallen angels, a roster that nearly disappeared from history. One of the most striking details Grock pulled from the Book of Enoch is that it actually names the fallen angels one by one. Not only their leader, Samjaza, but an entire roster of 200 watchers made their descent upon Mount Hermon. Names such as Azele, Armaros, Barakijal, Kakabal, and Zachiel show up in the text, each assigned particular roles. Azel draws especially significant attention. According to the Book of Enoch, Azel passed on to humanity the knowledge of crafting swords, shields, and breastplates, essentially introducing the technology of war. He also introduced women to the art of adornment using metals and jewelry, something the text presents as a form of moral corruption. God's judgment in the text is aimed specifically at Azel, who is bound and cast into darkness to await the final reckoning. What Grock identified here was a direct textual link to Leviticus 16 in the Bible, where the scapegoat ritual takes place. One goat is offered up to God, and the other is sent out into the wilderness for Azazel. Most readers of the Bible have never come across a truly satisfying explanation for who or what Azazel actually represents in that passage. The Book of Enoch supplies that missing context, and Grock made the connection clear and explicit in its analysis. This is precisely the kind of cross-referencing that makes AI-assisted study of ancient texts genuinely valuable. Without Grock, drawing that same connection would require working through multiple books, multiple translations, and a considerable volume of academic literature. The AI condensed all of that research and laid it out in a way that ordinary people could actually follow and dig into further. The astronomical sections, ancient precision that caught everyone off guard. Chapters 72 through 82 of the Book of Enoch are referred to as the Book of the Luminaries, or the Astronomical Book. This portion is actually among the oldest sections of the entire text, with fragments uncovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls that date back to roughly 200 BCE. It covers the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and does so with striking detail for the time period in which it was composed. Grock's analysis drew attention to the fact that this section outlines a 364-day solar calendar, a framework built around 4 seasons of 91 days each. This differs from the lunar calendar that dominated most Jewish religious observance, and it aligns with the calendar system found in other Dead Sea Scrolls documents, including the communal calendar followed by the Essenes. That alignment has led certain scholars to propose that the group responsible for preserving the Dead Sea Scrolls had a meaningful connection to the tradition that gave rise to the Book of Enoch. The AI also pointed out that the astronomical descriptions throughout this section, while not accurate by modern scientific standards, reflect a sophisticated observational framework that would have demanded patient, long-term study of the night sky. The depiction of the sun's gates, 6 along the eastern horizon and 6 along the western, corresponds to a genuine, observable phenomenon. The sun truly does rise and set at noticeably different positions along the horizon across the course of a year, and tracking those shifting points was fundamental to how ancient peoples built their calendars. What makes this section so compelling is that it isn't mythology. It represents an effort at a methodical, empirical account of how the universe operates, written thousands of years ago by someone who clearly devoted enormous time to watching the heavens. Grock's capacity to set this against what is known of ancient astronomical traditions made the resulting analysis unusually rich and layered. The dream visions, genuine prophecy, or a historical record written in disguise. Chapters 83 through 90 contain what are referred to as the dream visions. Enoch describes 2 distinct visions he experienced. The first is a harrowing vision of a catastrophic flood consuming the earth. The second is an extended allegorical journey through world history, sometimes called the animal apocalypse, in which all the central figures of biblical history are portrayed as animals. Adam and Eve appear as white bulls, the Israelites as sheep, and their various oppressors as predatory creatures. Grock's treatment of this section was particularly compelling because it applied a concept that historians refer to as vaticinium ex eventu, meaning prophecy composed after the events it appears to foretell, and yet it didn't make the final cut. Grock explained that by the time those councils met, the Book of Enoch was associated more with speculative and esoteric traditions than with the emerging orthodoxy the early church was trying to establish. There were also questions about authorship. The book claims to be written by Enoch himself, a figure who lived before Noah. By late antiquity, many church leaders had concluded that this claim couldn't be taken at face value, which undermined its authority as scripture. The AI flagged that certain sections of the animal apocalypse are historically precise about events in Israelite history, so precise, in fact, that they appear to have been composed with first-hand knowledge of those events. This is a mainstream scholarly observation, not some fringe theory, and it raises genuine questions about exactly when different portions of the book were written and by whom. But the vision doesn't end there. It pushes forward into a description of things yet to come, a final great battle, the defeat of evil, and the transformation of the world into something peaceful and restored. Grock noted that this eschatological vision, this picture of the end of the age, shares unmistakable structural parallels with the book of Revelation in the New Testament, including a sequence of great tribulation followed by divine judgment and a renewed earth. The question this surfaces, which the AI presented neutrally, is one theologians and scholars genuinely argue over. Did the writers of Revelation draw from the Enochic tradition? The textual overlaps are close enough that most scholars say yes, the influence is real. Grock made that argument clearly and connected specific passages from both texts to demonstrate it. The Son of Man, the title Jesus used for himself. This is where the AI's analysis became genuinely striking for a lot of people. Chapters 46 through 48 of the Book of Enoch describe a heavenly figure called the Son of Man, a being who existed before creation itself, who sits beside God on his throne, and who will judge the wicked and vindicate the righteous at the end of days. This matters because Son of Man is the title Jesus uses for himself more than any other throughout the Gospels, roughly 80 times across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the Gospel of Mark especially, Jesus applies it in contexts that map very closely to the Enochic Son of Man, a coming figure of cosmic authority and judgment. Grock's textual comparison flagged that the specific qualities given to the Son of Man in 1 Enoch, pre-existence, divine authority, the role of judge, association with light and wisdom, align so closely with the theological claims made about Jesus in the New Testament that scholars have been debating the connection for decades. Some argue Jesus was deliberately invoking the Enochic title to signal to his listeners exactly what kind of figure he was claiming to be. Others suggest the influence was more diffuse and cultural. What the AI clarified is that this connection is neither new nor fringe. It has been discussed in academic theology since the 19th century. But because the Book of Enoch doesn't appear in most people's Bibles, the average churchgoer has simply never encountered this background. Running the text through Grock made that connection visible and accessible to a far broader audience. Why was it left out of the Bible? That's the question everyone lands on, and Grock gave a careful, layered answer when prompted directly. The short answer is that the Book of Enoch wasn't removed from any Bible. It was never formally included in the Hebrew Bible or the later Protestant Old Testament to begin with. It was passed over during the canonization process, which unfolded at different times across different religious traditions. The rabbinical Jewish authorities who standardized the Hebrew Bible around the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era chose not to include it. One likely reason is that its content, particularly the Watcher's narrative and its elaborate angelology, was considered potentially dangerous or theologically problematic. At a moment when Jewish identity was under intense strain following the destruction of the Second Temple, religious leaders may have wanted to consolidate around texts that held clearer doctrinal boundaries. For early Christianity, the councils that shaped the biblical canon, Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era, Carthage in 397 of the Common Era, deliberated over many texts. By the time those councils convened, the Book of Enoch had already been circulating for centuries and had clearly left its mark on Christian theology. But its vivid portrayals of fallen angels and its intricate cosmology may have made it challenging to incorporate into the theological structure the early church was constructing. Grock presented several scholarly viewpoints on this and observed that no single tidy explanation exists. What the AI did flag as noteworthy is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which holds the oldest unbroken Christian tradition anywhere in the world, maintained the Book of Enoch within its canon throughout history. They were never part of the Roman ecclesiastical process that shaped the Western biblical canon. So whether the book was removed or simply never included depends entirely on which Christian tradition you happen to be asking about. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm the book's antiquity. One piece of evidence that no serious researcher disputes is the unearthing of Book of Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947. More than 20 Aramaic and Hebrew fragments from various sections of 1st Enoch were recovered there, and they date to somewhere between 200 BCE and 100 BCE. This places the Book of Enoch among the most well-represented texts at Qumran. More copies of it were found there than of many books that made it into the canonical Old Testament. Grock highlighted this point when asked about the historical credibility of the text. The AI noted that the Dead Sea Scrolls evidence establishes beyond any reasonable doubt that the Book of Enoch was widely known, extensively copied, and regarded as a significant religious text by at least one major Jewish community during the very period when Jesus and his contemporaries were living. This is not speculation, it is archaeology. The astronomical sections of the book found at Qumran are especially old, predating the final assembled form of 1st Enoch. This indicates that different portions of the text had independent histories before being brought together into the version we have today, which is actually quite common among ancient religious writings. Grock's analysis approached the text using the same academic framework applied to other ancient documents, and the conclusion drawn is that it is genuinely ancient, genuinely significant, and genuinely worthy of serious scholarly attention. For viewers interested in exploring the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, the Israel Antiquities Authority offers a digital resource at their website where scroll fragments can be viewed directly. What the AI had to say about the theology of judgment is worth dwelling on. A substantial portion of the Book of Enoch concerns itself with divine judgment, the destiny of the wicked, the vindication of the righteous, and the ultimate destruction of those who oppressed God's people. Grock's examination of this theme generated some of the most detailed and compelling output across the entire experiment. The AI observed that the theology of judgment in 1st Enoch is more developed and structured than what one encounters in the canonical Old Testament. There are descriptions of places where the souls of the dead await judgment, divided into separate compartments for the righteous and the wicked, with different conditions based on how each person lived and died. This stands as one of the earliest and clearest examples of a fully developed afterlife theology within the Jewish tradition, and it maps closely onto concepts that surface later throughout the New Testament. Grock also drew attention to the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, which contains what is known as the Apocalypse of Weeks, a structured history of the world divided into 10 ages or weeks. This section delivers pointed warnings against the wealthy and powerful who oppress the poor, using language that is strikingly direct and carries a strong social charge. Several New Testament scholars have drawn comparisons between the tone of this section and the letter of James in the Bible, as well as the woes Jesus delivered during the Sermon on the Mount. The broader picture that Grock painted of the Book of Enoch's theology is of a text that took divine justice with profound moral seriousness, one deeply preoccupied with the suffering of the innocent and the accountability of those in power. That message, the AI noted, remains consistent across every section of the book, regardless of authorship or dating. Among the most striking results from feeding the Book of Enoch into Grock was the comparative breakdown it produced alongside other ancient mythological traditions. The AI found parallel narrative structures and texts from cultures that, according to mainstream historical understanding, had zero direct contact with ancient Israel. The flood prophecy in Enoch connects in an obvious way to the Sumerian tale of Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which actually predates the biblical flood story. But Grock pushed even further, drawing structural comparisons between the descent of the Watchers and the Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki, sky-associated divine beings who engaged with human civilization. It also flagged connections to the Greek myth of the Titans, who passed forbidden knowledge to humanity before Zeus locked them away. Now, this part matters. The AI was upfront that these parallels don't establish a shared historical event. From a scholarly standpoint, what they point to is either cultural diffusion, stories traveling between societies through trade and contact, or separate cultures independently building narratives to make sense of the same fundamental human concerns: where evil comes from, what happens when forbidden knowledge is pursued, and what follows when beings overstep boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. What Grock's analysis offered was a clearly structured map of these connections that an everyday audience could genuinely follow. Rather than flipping through a dozen mythology textbooks, viewers had the relationships laid out right in front of them. It's worth taking a moment to address what academic thinking about the Book of Enoch actually looks like in 2024 and 2025, because serious scholars have not been ignoring this text the way popular media sometimes implies. When Grock was asked about the scholarly reception of the book, it drew from a meaningful body of legitimate academic work. Researchers like George W. E. Nicholsburg, who authored the standard academic commentary on First Enoch for the Hermania series, have dedicated entire careers to demonstrating this text's theological richness and historical significance. Gabriele Boccaccini at the University of Michigan established the Enoch Seminar, an international community of scholars focused entirely on Enochic Judaism and its reach into early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. This is serious, peer-reviewed scholarship, nowhere near the fringes. What Grock brought to light is that within academic biblical studies, the influence of the Enochic tradition on early Christianity is actually well established. The scholarly debate isn't about whether that influence exists. It's about measuring how deep it went and in which direction it flowed. Did early Christians draw on Enochic thinking around the Son of Man and angelology? Most scholars would say yes, almost certainly. Did the Book of Enoch shape how the followers of Jesus understood who he was and what his mission meant? A significant number of scholars make exactly that argument. The distance between what academics understand about this text and what ordinary people sitting in church pews have ever been told is genuinely enormous, and that gap is precisely why AI-driven analysis of this material draws such a broad audience. Grock effectively opened up a body of scholarship that had been collecting dust in university libraries for generations. With honesty and accuracy in mind, it's also worth addressing what Grock's analysis simply could not do, because not every claim circulating about this experiment holds up equally well. Grock is a language model. It finds patterns in text and builds connections based on what it was trained on. It has no capacity to verify historical claims, confirm whether supernatural events took place, or tell us whether anything described in the Book of Enoch literally occurred. When certain online voices have suggested that Grock proved the Book of Enoch is historically accurate, or that artificial intelligence confirmed the Nephilim were real, that is a straightforward misreading of what the technology actually accomplished. What Grock can do is identify literary and theological patterns, draw cross-textual comparisons, and present scholarly perspectives in a clear and digestible way. What it simply cannot do is settle debates that historians, archaeologists, and theologians have been wrestling with for centuries. Whether the Watchers were literal beings, symbolic figures, or pure mythology is not a question any artificial intelligence can answer definitively. And Grock itself, when prompted thoughtfully, will tell you exactly that. There's also the matter of what gets lost in translation. The Book of Enoch was originally composed in Aramaic and Hebrew, then preserved in Ge'ez. Every translation requires choices to be made. Grock was working primarily from English translations, specifically editions like R. H. Charles' 1917 translation, and the more recent E. Isaac translation found in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Different translators emphasize different things, and the AI's analysis naturally reflects whatever decisions those translators made along the way. That's not a reason to throw the analysis out entirely. It's a reason to treat it as a starting point rather than a final destination. And to Grock's credit, when asked directly about its own limitations, it acknowledges them honestly and openly. The Book of Enoch is a genuine ancient text of real historical significance that was excluded from most Western Bibles, yet carefully preserved by the Ethiopian Church and confirmed as authentically ancient through the Dead Sea Scrolls. When fed through Grock AI, the patterns it identified, the connections to biblical theology, the Son of Man title, the Watcher's narrative, the fallen angel roster, the astronomical sections are all things serious scholars have spent decades examining. The AI didn't uncover anything supernatural or previously unknown, but it made something genuinely important far more accessible to ordinary people. And honestly, that might matter more than any single finding it produced. If the Book of Enoch was widely known among Jesus and his disciples, why do you think it never made it into the Bible most of us grew up reading? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.